My first meeting with him entirely changed my opinion of him and of what I might expect from him. I remember this meeting very well. We arrived at a small cafe in a noisy, though not central street. I saw a man of an oriental type, no longer young, with a black moustache and piercing eyes, who astonished me first of all because he seemed to be disguised and completely out of keeping with the place and its atmosphere. I was still full of impressions of the East, and this man with the face of an Indian Rajah or an Arab Sheikh, whom I had once seemed to see in a white burnous or a gilded turban, seated here in this little cafe where small dealers and commission agents met together, in a black overcoat with a velvet collar and a black bowler hat, produced the strange, unexpected, and almost alarming impression of a man poorly disguised, the sight of whom embarrasses you because you see he is not what he pretends to be, and yet you have to speak and behave as though you did not see it. He spoke Russian incorrectly with a strong Caucasian accent, and this accent, with which we are accustomed to associate anything apart from philosophical ideas, strengthened still further the strangeness and the unexpectedness of this impression. It's an early excerpt there from P.D. Ouspensky's book, In Search of the Miraculous. The excerpt being about his first meeting with George Gurdjieff, the great spiritual teacher. So this is a review and sort of also will likely be an overview of the book In Search of the Miraculous, and it's going to be in a sense a different review, and it's not intended as such. It's just that the structure and purpose of the book by Ouspensky, In Search of the Miraculous, itself, it isn't a fictional book. It's an account of his meeting with Gurdjieff, and in that sense, it's also a retelling, a recounting of Gurdjieff's teaching as it was given to Ouspensky between the years 1915 to 1917, which is a sort of important fact, actually, which I'll get to later. The full title is In Search of the Miraculous, Fragments of an Unknown Teaching. And I believe, actually, that the subtitle, The Fragments of an Unknown Teaching, was meant to be the initial title. This idea of fragments trying to be put together and coalesced into sort of a holistic system, which you get the feeling of that from this book. It was initially published in 1949 and has had many reprints since then. I think it's always been in print, and this is the sort of my other edition was so beaten up that I got a new one recently by Crompton. This is sort of a facsimile edition of the first. So the reason I mentioned that this review will be a bit different is because, on the one hand, what this book is for the majority of people is the go-to place to try, understand, and involve oneself with the spiritual and mystical teachings, and maybe we could say philosophy, of George Gurdjieff, of G.I. Gurdjieff. This is pretty much anyone who is interested in Gurdjieff and anyone who is even affiliated with like Gurdjieff societies or work groups. If they say, well, where do I start? You'll pretty much always be pointed toward this book, which is a place I would agree with in part. I will say now that actually my own place that I point people towards is Kenneth Walker's book, A Study of Gurdjieff's Teaching, and that's where that little fact about this book, In Search of the Miraculous, being about 1915 to 1917, kind of comes in, because I do think Gurdjieff's teaching changes, not the concepts, not the ideas. There's key ideas that always stay throughout, but his own approach to the work and the ideas does seem to change. And so a book written much later about the whole system, I think, is also, so take the two of them, basically. But why it's also peculiar is because I will give an overview, probably quite a long one, of Gurdjieff's teachings as taken from In Search of the Miraculous. But what also interests me about the book, as per the title, is that it's an extremely mysterious book. In fact, just after when it was first published, I've heard stories that it was often given to people in the work almost wrapped in brown paper, like a sort of secret thing that was handed around with some sort of covertness, some sort of subtlety. A lot of this was to do with, I think, Ouspensky's affiliations with various things, but also, the early days of the Fourth Way, which was the name of Gurdjieff's school, and when it really began after Gurdjieff, I think there was a sort of certain amount of privacy, and there still is, retained for it. So there is an air of mystery around this book, both in its content, in what it is, but also in its elusiveness, because I sort of want to focus on it as a book review, as if I've read this book so many times now. I've kind of lost count in a way, because I'm always dipping in and out of it fairly consistently. It's one of the most important books to come into my life, you could say. And this time going through it, both for a review, because I wanted to look at it for a review, this time I approached it as if I hadn't heard of it. I thought to myself, well, what I'll do is I'll read this book as if, I've never read the blurb, never read a Amazon description, and have no idea what it really is at all. And I tried to approach it in that way. And approaching in that way was very revealing, because it's just so peculiar. It's just such an odd tale for its time. It's a book that you feel when you're reading it as if, to be quite honest, that it should be a mythological story tucked away in some forgotten manuscript. And I'm not trying to oversell it. And Ouspensky's, as you can see from the first excerpt I gave there, Ouspensky's own style, which is very much like his character, which is to be expected, quite terse, quite dense, very matter of fact. He wants to get to the point, even written by Ouspensky in his style, in the days before he became fully serious, which he was at the end there, but still, he's a very, very serious man, very upright. Even written in his almost monosyllabic factual style, like a spiritual scientist, even in that style, the wonder and mystery that comes through is quite incredible. One could say it's miraculous even. And what I mean by that is just this general narrative, and I'll quickly go through the narrative, but the narrative of Peter Ouspensky, who at this point has been a spiritual seeker for a long time. He's been in the East. He's been a serious spiritual seeker, and this is just before the years of 1915. He's written some books of his own by this point, and to be honest, in the West, I think he would have been known as one of the sort of known entities of spiritual seeking and alternative spirituality, and esotericism. And so he's been in the East. He's journeyed all around in search of the miraculous, as he's put it. And he, through various reasons, it's really because of this advert for a ballet. He didn't really have much else to do at the time, so he just goes along. He meets a man who at that point is known to him as G, as in the letter G, Gurdjieff, which was what many of his direct followers at the time called him, and many people now still refer to Gurdjieff as G. Basically, he meets him and finds that this is what he's been looking for. He joins his school. He begins learning the systems of which I'll go into, the system basically of spiritually materialistic self-development, that for anyone in philosophy does have large emphasis in terms of the metaphysics on Plato, and subtle elements of Neoplatonism, but equally, if you really wanted to try dig in and deconstruct Gurdjieff, you would have to have a thorough knowledge of Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Platonism, Sufism. Islam. Like it borrows from everything and translates it for the Western mind of the day. This was, in a way, Gurdjieff's big mission. And the thing I think he saw as needing to be done for a man who, like Steiner and many other big spiritual figures, understood that there was a spiritual evolutionary process that needed to be done, that needed that humans were part of a long spiritual evolution, and Gurdjieff and Steiner et al. Were all part of this in some way, and so they had to find a way to sort of convert the spiritual teachings that really just had not found their footing in the modern world into a form which could be understood, basically, and digested by the modern mind. And I think Gurdjieff is one of the most successful in this. I think Steiner does it in his own ways, but Steiner for me was never as practical. But I don't think there's one teacher that fits all. I think much like psychoanalysts, eventually you find the one that fits you, and one that fits to help with your equilibrium that you need, that your imbalance, one might say. It seems that Gurdjieff at the time, and still to this day, I think, is often the last port. For many, many people is the last port, because it has a strictness that other places really don't. And Gurdjieff himself has this feeling of sincerity that other places often don't, especially in a time like today, filled with a lot of rather flimsy woo-woo. Anyway, basically, the bulk of the book, which is why this is a strange review, because it's almost like reviewing a textbook if I just took it straight on the content. The bulk of the book is Ouspensky recounting learning the system. All right, so the majority of the paragraphs have quotation marks like around them, as if to say, this is Gurdjieff talking. Now, one fact about this is that it's an astounding feat of Ouspensky's memory, because Gurdjieff forbid anyone from taking notes early on, and that stayed for a very, very long time, and it definitely stayed for all the years that Ouspensky was there. So all of this, practically all of this, I'm sure maybe there was times where he managed to sneak in a notepad, probably, but near enough all of this is Ouspensky having a conversation with Gurdjieff, learning the system, and then traveling home and writing it down. And he's not just writing down like there's a small idea, 2 sentences. He's writing down full conversations with Gurdjieff. It's an astounding feat of his memory. But equally, as I was saying, the bulk of the book is kind of Gurdjieff retelling his whole system through Ouspensky and being put down. It takes years for this book to be allowed to be published, because it's kind of one of the first full, like, here's the system that has actually been very secret to work groups for so long. And he also describes basically not just the system, but his experience with Gurdjieff, various exercises, though, as with the majority of Gurdjieff adjacent books, other than self-remembering, and maybe a couple of other little things. Most exercises you don't find too many. Self-remembering is one, self-observation is another, maybe some subtle ones to do with what's known as identification, which I'll get to. But it's a strange one, because the book holds a resonance of Gurdjieff and what it was like to perhaps be with Gurdjieff, and what it's like to be with a teacher of that caliber, which comes through. And also, this is really the only thing I'll say about my own experience that has been carried through to today, and that's what you get from work groups. But that's all I'll say there. Anyway, the book concludes with the experiences during the Bolshevik Revolution, Gurdjieff escaping to the West, where they begin. Gurdjieff founds the priory in France, in La Fontainebleau, and then Ouspensky kind of goes his own way. At a certain point, the book ends kind of abruptly, actually, and describes Ouspensky's reasons to sort of teach on his own and things like this. There's a whole book called The Struggle of the Magicians, actually, about the relationship between the two. Some people, not in that book, but some people, Gary Lachman, I believe, in his biography of Ouspensky, not so subtly gestures towards the idea that actually Ouspensky meeting Gurdjieff possibly wasn't the best thing for him, which is, I'm intrigued by that reading, because it's a rare And I hope I've done Lachman. I don't want to paraphrase Lachman too much in that sense. So there's a lot of angles here that interest me as a book, because what it's doing and what its intention has been since day one is a hefty one. It is carrying the weight of an entire spiritual teaching that was largely held up, pretty much all entirely held up by one man, which was Gurdjieff, who by literally every single account, there's no account of Gurdjieff where someone says, oh yeah, he was all right. Every single account of Gurdjieff leans towards some notion that he was remarkable, that at the very least his presence absolutely filled the room, and that you were dealing with a fully conscious, embodied human being that was kind of just outside of the bounds of anyone you'd ever met. Even his detractors, attested to this, which there were many. And so the excerpts that I'm going to read aren't really the bits of quotation, because what I will go through Gurdjieff's system as briefly as I can, but what I'm intrigued by is the setting, is the feeling of mystery, the feeling of, basically, as I approached this book as if I'd never read it before and was completely ignorant of it, there is an overwhelming feeling, again I'll use the word resonance, of what the hell is going on? Who is this strange Gurdjieff figure who no one ever, even his closest, both Ouspensky and Jean de Salzman, and various other people who were extremely close to him, no one ever said that they ever really knew the real Gurdjieff. Who was this man who was playing 1,000 different roles, while simultaneously coming up with one of the most thorough and uniquely contextual spiritual systems of the modern day, whilst also sort of weaving his way throughout the entire world on his own spiritual quest regarding the evolution and sort of redemption of man, whilst also not avoiding, but dealing with the fact of 2 wars eventually, and throughout all of that, managing to always have resources, like abundant resources. One thing in World War II, during the World War II era of Gurdjieff's teaching, largely in Paris, one thing that all the students attested to was that they found it astounding that every time they went there, he managed to have things like bonbons and ingredients for dishes that were bizarre even for this day, and he always managed to have sort of this strange abundance of resources as if from nowhere. And so this is a sort of level of competency that's borders on, again, the miraculous, borders on the strange. And the book, one thing this is kind of what I want to get through in this review, is that even if you're not that spiritually inclined, if you're just interested in history, or if you're just interested in almost like a cultural anomaly, then this book is just this odd retelling of a very small period of an established writer and spiritual seeker and an extremely intelligent man, P.D. Ouspensky, sort of not butting heads, but just being drawn into the peculiarity of Gurdjieff's world. And that alone is incredible. But when you combine that with the events of all these years, it just becomes this whirlwind of spiritual and cultural striving and overcoming. So another little excerpt, and then I will go into the system because it's kind of needed. Why not have a meeting tonight? Ring up those who wanted to come and tell them we shall be at such and such a place. I used to rush to the telephone, but of course at 7 or 7:30 in the evening, everybody was already engaged, and I could only collect a few people, and some who lived outside Petersburg, in Saskoy, etc., never succeeded in coming to our meetings. A great deal I afterwards understood differently from the way I did then, and G's chief motives became clear to me. He by no means wanted to make it easy for people to become acquainted with his ideas. On the contrary, he considered that only by overcoming difficulties, however irrelevant and accidental, could people value his ideas. People do not value what is easily come by, he said. And if a man has already felt something, believe me, he will sit waiting all day at the telephone in case he should be invited. Or he will himself ring up and ask and inquire. And whoever expects to be asked, and ask beforehand, so that he can arrange his own affairs, let him go on expecting. Of course, for those who are not in Petersburg, this is certainly difficult, but we cannot help it. Later on, perhaps, we shall have definite meetings on fixed days. At present, it is impossible to do this. People must show themselves in their valuation of what they have heard. All this and much else besides still remained for me at that time, half open to question. But the lectures, and in general, all that G said at that time, both at the meetings and outside them, interested me more and more. And so we enter into this world of difficulty. My favorite example of this, actually, with regard to G, with Gurdjieff creating difficulty for students, often highly contextual to help them overcome certain parts of their sleep, which I'll get to, was with the pianist who did a lot of incredible work with Gurdjieff, Thomas de Hartmann. And de Hartmann, very sort of high, upper class, almost like aristocratic of the day, a known composer and pianist. And where does Gurdjieff decide to meet him for the first time? It's in this like cafe, low class cafe, full to the brim with prostitutes and everything that is untoward regarding de Hartmann. And he, it's a test contextual to him to see whether or not he again values the ideas. So as I said, the bulk of it is teaching. And I don't want to say there's a betrayal, but as you can sort of see in that excerpt, this idea of Gurdjieff wanting to make his ideas difficult, one might say, well, what place does a text such as In Search of the Miraculous have in that? Like, does it portray the idea that one only values these ideas if they overcome something to get to them? And of course, without Gurdjieff being alive, and without, and also with the advent of things like the internet and the paperback boom and ease of printing, of course, things changed that just weren't the case, especially in like 1915, 17. But equally, I would say I don't think this book, and I actually don't think any book on the Fourth Way or Gurdjieff's teaching has ever really betrayed that idea of overcoming the difficulties, because and this is going to be a bit frustrating and maybe a little bit prodding to those that have written books on Gurdjieff, but I think there's two categories of Gurdjieff books, and In Search of the Miraculous falls in one, which still adheres to the fragmentation of one's own overcoming of the valuation of the system is one's ability to sit with it and piece it together. And this book gives you a lot, but you still at the end have to piece a lot together in yourself with regard to self-work and self-introspection. And there's many other books like that. I think Kenneth Walker's actually do the same thing. And there's the C.S. Is it C.S.? Yeah, C.S. Knotts also do the same thing, where you're sort of given these flames of quality and you have to try cohere them into what exactly they mean. The other category is there's a lot written about Gurdjieff, like a ridiculous amount, and the system. The other category would be actually a lot of these books that try attest to like Gurdjieff's teaching, like the basic ideas or something like this, on various maybe second generation students writing books trying to be like, and then there's this, then there's this, then there's this. And anyone who's read or spent some time with books of the first kind will find that these second books, this second type, just fall flat. And it's almost like the Fourth Way can't really be portrayed as a system. There isn't going to be this book where you've suddenly tied a bow around it and say like, oh, okay, I've got it, and now I do this. It's just not how it works. And so on the one hand, they fall flat. On the other hand, they retain the mystery. And of course, the books of the first kind are far more rare. And actually, I would also say that what's interesting is that the books of the first kind almost always use story and narrative. So in his book Venture with Ideas, which is about his meeting with Gurdjieff, Kenneth Walker also does this, and you realize that it's reading about the very sense of overcoming and taking these things seriously and having to enter into sort of socially uncomfortable or strange situations that begets the very feeling and resonance that is required for the valuation of these ideas. And In Search of the Miraculous is a key example of that. Now I'm going to try in probably about 30 minutes. Not saying all that, I'm going to try in about 30 minutes to give you what is roughly spoken about in Search of the Miraculous. Now, one thing on this, again, like I said, this is a book about the teaching of Gurdjieff between the years of 1915 and 1917 that is then published in 1949. So it's about 2 years of the Gurdjieff work, very early on in the work. Ouspensky dies in 47, Gurdjieff dies in 49. So it's very early on in the work. And though the many key ideas don't change, that I'll get to, man is a machine, sleep, the centers, those don't change, Gurdjieff's temperament changes. And I think from that, Gurdjieff's approach to how to approach students changes. And one thing about In Search of the Miraculous is you have this twofold thing of, in the early days, Gurdjieff seems far, far, far more systematic. He's giving like structured talks on, right, now we're going to talk about the centers, and there's a lot more diagrams, there's a lot more fiddly stuff, and there's a lot more about something called the hydrogens and the system of hydrogens. Now, very few people have written about hydrogens. One, Robin Bloor, has written books about the hydrogens theory. I would personally say that I think it just dropped off. I just think Gurdjieff realized that I didn't find it anywhere else. I didn't find any other key Gurdjieff thinkers that ever really used it in any practical way. And either something got dropped off in the transmission or it's kind of lost. But I think if I'm being honest, it even is a struggle in this book. So this is about a certain time in the teaching that was very systematic. And the other part of that is that Ouspensky, as this sort of spiritual scientist type who's really trying to dot the I's, cross the T's, and very intellectually heavy, is very interested in those elements. I think he's trying to find a system. But whereas when you're reading about Gurdjieff and his interaction with people, you realize that the holistic teaching is, okay, you take a little bit of the system, but it's about being in the world, being with your emotions, being with your body, being with a group, being with other people all at once. So the idea of like, I'm going to read a book and get it, it's never going to be the case, which is also why it's always just an elusive book, because there's parts of it that will never come through in that sense. So really with Gurdjieff's system, I'm just going to take another sip of water. Really with Gurdjieff's system, you begin in various places, but something's, like any good spiritual system, something's up. And for Gurdjieff, it's that we're asleep. This isn't a metaphor. It's not a metaphor regarding man's approach to the world. It's meant literally that man is sleepwalking through life. He's living in a sleepwalking world. A world wherein he's just in a lessened state of consciousness, and yet imagine that they're fully awake. So for Gurdjieff, there is the normal sleep, then there is waking sleep, then there is being conscious, and then there is cosmic consciousness, which isn't mentioned as much, but that's sort of like adjacent to maybe being awakened or something like this. The immediate reaction to most people is that this can't be, that that we're awake, that we are conscious of the world, that of course we are. Of course I'm awake, right? But the example that's given by Ouspensky from his own experience at a certain point when told this is that the idea of walking down a street and realizing that you're a machine, that you're asleep. So you walk down a street and you have one intention or something like this. The intention is just to go to the store and buy a sandwich or whatever it might be. And next thing you know, you see a bird and that reminds you of something else. So now you're thinking about that and you aren't paying attention really to anything. And maybe when you're thinking about the bird, a blue car passes by and you remember that you need to do your insurance on your car. And then before you know it, you've walked maybe half a mile to this store and you've just been dragged everywhere. You're completely asleep. You just haven't been there. The most common example that's given by most people who are trying to give an example of what Gurdjieff means by sleep is people who drive will know about this. But if you do a drive often, I don't know, maybe you have a drive where you drive every day to work, you commute. More often than not, people will kind of find themselves 40 minutes later, and they've arrived and they have just basically no recollection really of existing, but obviously they did exist. And so that is the basis, is that we are, to quote Gurdjieff, we are immersed in dreams. We are living in sleep. We are a machine. We can't stop our flow of thoughts. We can't control our imagination. We can't control our emotions. We can't control our attention. We don't see the real world because we are just asleep. We are hidden from the world because of this machinic existence. So time passes, things happen. We haven't really been anywhere. It's a mechanical existence. As Gurdjieff states, men are machines and nothing but mechanical actions can be expected of machines. This in itself is one of the more famous things of Gurdjieff, where he says that you're existing in a prison, but you don't even know you're within a prison. The first thing to do when you're in a prison is to realize you're in a prison, and then if you want to get out, you of course have to talk to someone who has previously got out, which is someone such as him, or maybe someone else who's a bit awakened. And so you are a mechanical machine that really has no control over your emotions or your body or your thoughts. And much like, I mean, there is a lot of Plato in Gurdjieff, but much like the Plato's allegory of the cave and the sort of terminally important aspect of the cave, which is that when the escapee of the cave comes back in to try warn everyone that they're in a prison, they want to kill him. And so Gurdjieff found that there was a hostility toward this idea of being a machine, because what he's ultimately telling people is that if you're a machine, you have no free will. So you have no free will is really the starting point of being asleep, of being a machine. The starting point of Gurdjieff's system is, by the majority of all standards of the West, extremely pessimistic. You have no free will. You're in your job, you have no free will. In your marriage, in your relationships, in everything, you have no free will. But immediately, in a sense, it does kind of flip to an almost hardcore form of optimism, which is you don't have free will, but you can earn it. You can develop it, which is equally for some a metaphor, but for some quite absolute, is Gurdjieff's own theory of the soul, which is that you're not born with a soul, but you can grow one. And this is where I think for a lot of people who are understanding of Platonic and also Neoplatonic philosophy, this is where you see Gurdjieff transforming and sort of transmuting a Platonist understanding of finer and finer substances into an admittedly, for most people, heretical form of Christianity, wherein what is basically, in short, when you're trying to move from sleep and wake up via self-remembering, which when one remembers himself or is attention being so almost like the economy of consciousness, what is being built in a literal finer finer substance for Gurdjieff is your soul. You're building a soul, which is something that can go through to the next side, next side, you could say, or heaven or hell. Maybe I don't want to go that far here, but this is basically the foundation. The beginning of this book is that, and the beginning of the system is that Gurdjieff's just telling you everything you don't want to hear, and it's all in one. It's all in one understanding that just everything, your thoughts, your emotions, where you are, you just haven't chosen it. You don't have free will. You are a machine. And there's various points in the book where Ouspensky stops and looks around and sort of just notices that everyone is machines. That they're just machinically undertaking their lives. And my favorite is that as it is during the war, Gurdjieff and Ouspensky are walking along somewhere, and Ouspensky looks at a truck of crutches, as if crutches for people who've got issues with their legs, crutches to kind of push yourself along, and they're all new. And Ouspensky comments that they are crutches for legs and limbs yet blown off, because they're all being made for the war, which is ongoing. So legs and limbs yet blown off. It becomes this scene becomes for Gurdjieff a tragic, ultimately a tragic understanding of his theory, which is that this is just going to happen. This is how man is, because he doesn't have free will. And so this slow sort of dawning realization for Ouspensky and for others involved in this system of, like, each day, how conscious are you? How much of your day can you remember? 30 seconds, 5 minutes, anything. Each day sort of blurring into the next as this machine. And I think early on in the book, we see a sort of tension building of a real yearning for Ouspensky to get the system, because he wants out. He wants out of the prison. But equally, attention for, I think there's a tension all the way through Gurdjieff's life. And dare I say it, I do think he saw his system as a failure by the end. There is a picture of him the last picture of him, I believe, taken while he was alive. A picture of him sat on a bench, just completely slumped. And I'm not sure he considered his system a success, whether or not he considered people had got out, or if enough had really happened. I personally don't think so. It's my pessimistic view of things. And so what you do to try to get out of this is really the key Gurdjieff and fourth way practice, which is self-remembering, which is a state as per the one sec, let me find my notes on this, because these are all a bit mixed around. Is a state unto which, basically, as you can imagine from the name, is you observe yourself, you remember yourself. So you're trying to confirm, first of all, that you're a machine, that there is truth to these ideas. That I think this is very easily confirmed, probably in over about an hour. If someone, or maybe even 10 minutes, go for a walk for 10 minutes and tell yourself that if you have free will, I'm going to remember the feeling in my left foot for the whole 10 minutes. You will, of course, last far less than you imagine, probably about 10 seconds before, oh, there's a thought that came in, or, oh, I saw like a butterfly and my emotions went one way, and, oh, there's a pang in my leg, so now everything is there, and you slowly become face to face with something that you can't deny, that everything you've done is think and feel is in sleep is of a machine. And the point then is to say, well, if I'm on this lower level of waking sleep, what is it to raise your level of awareness? Raise your awareness and consciousness. If you have consciousness, to be conscious is to be aware. So to try and raise your level of awareness and to observe ourselves. This is the witnessing kind of deal that we see in other teachers such as Krishnamurti or various others. And what you begin to observe is where your attention is going, what it's being taken by, and where remembering comes in, at its most basic, is the division of one's attention. So a certain amount of attention is directed back to the self, whilst one is also acting, they sort of also remember themselves. And it's from this division that one's identification, one's kind of giving over of attention, may or may not lessen. And it's also a mode of self-introspection. So when you're not just literally self-observing yourself in the sense of body, but if a part of your attention, a part of your consciousness is always self-remembering as much as you can, then what are the thoughts and who are the thoughts of? And this notion of then self-remembering and seeing that a thought has come in, which really you have no say in, begins to sort of prove, you could say, because Gurdjieff always says, just don't believe it. Gurdjieff, one of the reasons I was very open to Gurdjieff actually from the off is that one of the first things he says to Ouspensky and in various other places to students who've written about it is that just don't believe anything I've said. Like, don't believe. I'm going to tell you some things and go prove them for yourself. And if you don't agree with the things that have been said, then move on. It's not, you clearly don't see it that way, which is completely fine. But Gurdjieff would say, look, don't believe any of this. I'll tell you it. Go verify it for yourself. And so from this foundation of sleep, of lack of free will, and then the self-remembering into, say, one's thoughts, one will then begin to realize that they have what Gurdjieff calls multiple eyes. And multiple eyes is really about the contradictions, the hypocrisies of the supposed me, this idea I have of me. And one night I want to lose weight, and then the next morning I want to lose weight. The next morning, or whenever it might be, want to eat a cream bun. I want to get fit. I would prefer to sit on the sofa, right? This whole contradictory apparatus of the I. So for Gurdjieff, as opposed to many other spiritual teachers who would just say you're looking at the falsity of just say the false self, Gurdjieff does the intriguing thing of the spiritually materialist thing of trying to look at different eyes. And Kenneth Walker, in his own little biography, really digs into the theory of eyes for himself and comes up with all these kind of unique ones that have been controlling him. And I think it's both a way to reveal the falsity of the false self that isn't, what I actually am when I say I, which is just consciousness. But it's equally a way for the Western mind to not get lost in the vagueness of a singular false self, and to have something to look at. And I think Gurdjieff is always doing this, I think, with his, and it's why I think more than most other schools, it's why more than I think most other esoteric system and schools of modern times, Gurdjieff seems to get roots pretty deep, and because he is consistently taking ideas and as I've already said, transforming them in a way that can compute with the modern mind, and then from that alters it in such a way that it can then sort of see it as the way it might be seen in the East. I mean, it's one of Gurdjieff's great understandings, in a sense, is that you can't just sort of bring the East to the West and we'll understand it. Many would, of course, disagree with the sort of blanket distinction between East and West, but that is what it is. I mean, the work is often spoken about in that way, and Gurdjieff manages to do that in this sense of having very minute systems for us to dig into. And so we begin to self-remember, and we also begin to split things into different categories. So the first being really essence and personality. And essence is everything that you're born with, everything that you can call your own physicality, psychological potential, tendencies. It's the first stage, the part from which one can really grow. It's your core. You might even say it's close to the soul. It kind of grows up until the age of 3 and 4. This is one's essence. And it's internal. It's the real you, if you want to use fairly lax terms. And then personality surrounds it. So you have essence, the real you, let's say, and you have personality that surrounds it. It forms a thick shell. It's foreign to it. We might say, habits, postures. Maybe if you're a Reichian, you might say armor, opinions, what you consider normal, cultural, like striation, suggestibility, mimesis, imitation, likes, dislikes, negative emotions. All that we think we consider ourselves is this personality, which is a thick shell around us, quite literally an armor around us. But Gurdjieff, again, being practical, this isn't solely bad for him because essence, only growing up until 3 and 4, just can't grow on its own, right? It has to have a friction. You can't just kind of grow nothing in soil. You can't just have good soil. You need to grow something, but it can't just sort of miraculously find a plant. This seems to come from a friction, from a tension, from some engagement of that sort. And so in that sense, Gurdjieff would actually say for a while, and there was a time, I believe, where the ages unto which one could really join Gurdjieff, he relaxed this near the end, but I think it was between 25 and 55 years old. So if you were, and the reasons, if I'm remembering the ages right, the reasons for 25 to be the earliest start was your personality wasn't enough. Like you didn't have enough sort of seeds and manure, we could say, to actually get anything growing. Like you need to go live. You need to have gone and suffered, and you need to have developed, to be honest, you need to have developed personality. You need to develop vices, things that can be dug into as frictions. But the inverse of this was like, well, if you're older than 55, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Your personality is probably solidified to such a degree that either it's just you're never gonna get through it, or doing so is probably gonna like break you. This is gonna be too much. He did relax that near the end, but for Gurdjieff, personality is key, like in a productive negative sense of that you need all this, you need this kind of wealth of yourself to bad wealth to work through. I mean, how can you sort of develop if there's nothing to develop against? And so you have those two as a sort of foundation of what someone is. And then you move into the 3 centers, which is where Gurdjieff, I think people just are reluctant to mention this, but it's just where he takes Plato and transforms the Phaedrian chariot into his own chariot. And so you have a horse, a cart, and a rider. And so the horse is the emotional center. So we each have these 3 centers. The horse is the emotional center. The cart is the physical or the body center. And then the rider is the intellectual center. And so, it's it relates to the Phaedrian chariot, which in Plato is either going towards kind of like good places for the soul or bad places for the soul. Where Gurdjieff sort of immanentizes this down to the individual, and where you're riding along in this horse and chariot, let's say, or horse and cart, and we like to think that we're completely in control, right? The rider likes to think, well, I'm the intellect, we're going to go do this. But the point he's often making, well, the key point of this is that like we can be all intellectual and all reasoned and rational, but the emotions, the horse will, like, damn, we're off, right? And we've made a mistake, or we've gone somewhere that might be damaging, or we've given into the personality. And what's the point is harmony. The point is that the point is about language, really, because none of these speak the same language. The intellect doesn't speak emotionally. None of them talk to each other. They can't communicate. And the purpose of again, self-remembering, you can kind of think of it as taking a big step back and viewing the whole thing. Purpose of self-remembering is to look at how these are miscommunicating, and is to self-remember, is to self-observe. So you have these 3 centers, emotional, physical, and intellectual, which become man number 1, number 2, number 3. So man number 1 is mostly in his emotional, or whichever it might be, I can't remember now. Man number 1 is mostly in his emotional. Man number 2 is mostly in his physical. Man number 3 is mostly in his intellectual. There's like 7 men, but man number 4 is a balanced, like, equilibrium, we could say. He's the conscious man. Now, the reason I sort of am a bit flippant on them is because, again, with this, is that at this point in time, in 1915 to 17, Gurdjieff is very key to use terms of his system, like, so that people have this shared language in his groups. He might say, "You're man number one," or whatever it might be. This just falls off. He's not doing this near the end. I mean, this would be like, this system is built and then it's spread with a resonance throughout time. It's not like, right, go read this and learn all your lingo, and then we'll find out if you're man. If you're a man number one, and you need to do this self-remembering, and that's like not how it works. But it does sometimes come across like that in Search for the Miraculous. So it's again why I think like it needs to be paired with a later book to get the full scheme of things. Now, okay, so how long was that? It was about 20 minutes on some key aspects. I'm just checking my notes. So we've got sort of seen self-remembering. We've seen essence and personality. We've seen, okay. So there's some pretty key little bits there. If you're to go into the cosmology, if we're to go into the ray of creation and the scales, it can get very, very complicated, very systematic. And this is this is where like I will sort of turn this back into a review, is that you're just given this system. And a lot of it is like, you can go test it and blah, blah, blah. But a lot of it, I haven't actually marked out a page for this, but I'll see if I can find a lot of it, at times, you're suddenly like thrown into, see on the screen, these sort of charts about the hydrogens, or the charts about the ray of creation. And then, from one page to the next, one page you're reading about like, oh, Ouspensky's meeting Gurdjieff, and it's real life, right? These two people are meeting, and it's like a tale. And then the next page, he is from memory relaying this strange man's system, that now this thing that feels fictitious and mythological is bleeding into the real world, because he's talking about how I can develop. And then the next page, not literally, but you get the point, is, and here's like this cosmological systematic investigation into the minutiae of how an emotion might be working in some sort of cosmic rhythm. And you're like, what the hell am I? What am I reading? Like, what have I stepped into? And it's that sort of mystery, because it's just a mysterious book, and it's still a mysterious book. That's quite the astounding thing for me, and why I wanted to read it in this way. So to give another excerpt, just to break up my own talking. This is from the start of chapter 6. One of the next lectures began with a question asked by one of those present. What was the aim of his teaching? I certainly have an aim of my own, said G, but you must permit me to keep silent about it. Because at the present moment, my aim cannot have any meaning for you, because it is important that you should define your own aim. The teaching by itself cannot pursue any definite aim. It can only show the best way for men to attain whatever aims they may have. The question of aim is a very important question. Until a man has defined his own aim for himself, he will not be able even to begin to do anything. How is it possible to do anything without having an aim? Before anything else, doing presupposes an aim. And this goes on and on. This kind of talking goes on and on. And we see a mixture. At all times, we see a mixture of so many things, which is what makes the book basically kind of miraculous, dare I say it. So we see an author writing a book, obviously, who's trying to, in a very literal sense, say, here is Gurdjieff's system as I learned it. But we also see Ouspensky has a lot of skepticism in himself. So we also see him being very skeptical of the whole thing and writing the book in a skeptical manner for himself and for us. So we're always a bit, you can kind of like, I got to keep this at arm's length because I'm not sure what he's trying to convey. We also put into their relationship, Ouspensky's and G's, because he's simultaneously, while discussing the system, he's talking about their tensions and whether or not he trusts this man. We're also put into the development of groups of a very strange time in history, where spiritual groups are trying to basically develop themselves, and they're also being very secretive. We're also all times having to deal with the great shadow of G over everything. Like, this whole thing is to do with this peculiar, remarkable man who at all times you kind of just don't trust. Not in a horrible way, but what is this guy's, what is he up to? What's his deal? And so you can read it basically in so many ways, and I think it always manages to retain the mystery of the time, of the place, of the meeting. And it's kind of good in a way that those books that have really tried to knuckle down and be like, here's what Gurdjieff's system's about, and they almost always have their own little idiosyncratic thing, which they just fall flat because they haven't given over to the mystery. And a huge part of it is a huge part of the Gurdjieff work. And I'm now bringing in my own, not so idiosyncratic, but a little bit idiosyncratic. I think a huge part of the Fourth Way and of Gurdjieff in general is Gurdjieff talks about becoming a cunning man, or a cunning woman, of course. And I think, to give a metaphor, a huge part of all of this is knowing when to see if Gurdjieff has got a wry smile on, a coy or a sly smile, and what is he acting? What is the play? What is the impro that's happening right now? And this book manages to retain that grin. That there's always this, almost always the system is given, and Ouspensky's trying to hold to it in his often draconic style and personality. And you have this trickster in the background. The book is trying to sincerely engage with a trickster, with someone who, is one third mystic, one third philosophical transmuter and alchemist, like combining all these systems. And I mean this in a kind way because it's important. One third trickster charlatan, who's trying to get you to question, because he really wants you to not just agree with it because he's so sort of potently charismatic. He has to constantly throw in little seeds of almost tricksterishness, and it's key for any spiritual system. The one failing place is that Ouspensky's not great at conveying Gurdjieff's humor. There is a huge amount of humor in Gurdjieff in his own writings, especially Beelzebub's Tales and in such remarkable men. And when I've read other books about meetings, especially the Paris meetings, again, the whole thing changes. But the Paris meetings from 1940, there's this great sense of humor that doesn't come through. And it might not be Ouspensky, it might be the time, because again, the whole thing really does change. But and I'm not going to give any more excerpts, because so many of the excerpts are just the relaying of the system. And I do just want to sort of emphasize, because we're getting on for an hour, and really I want to not sell, but I want to, because it is just one of my favorite books, because what you're delving into is one of the few books that manages to actually transfer a teaching without that damaging reduction of the teaching, which in itself is about reduction of the mystery. Because what a lot of people want, and we see this, I think, even in books for world religions, books that are like explaining Buddhism, or explaining, here's how you do Buddhism, here's how you be a Christian, or here's how whatever it might be. We like things in the West, and it's kind of ironic that Gurdjieff was trying to translate everything for the West. We like things in the West where we can go, if you read this, you'll get it. As if you get to the last line, you go, got it, done. Right. And with spiritual stuff, I mean, spirituality is about experience. Spiritual teaching is about your own experience. It's about the friction of your experience of dealing with something here. And that is really a confrontation with either the miraculous or the mysterious. It's a confrontation with wonder and mystery. And so many modern spiritual books just don't really want to engage with mystery. They don't want to engage with the frustration of mystery, is that it's an unanswerable thing that really you only have yourself or maybe a group who will maybe have a look and they'll go, oh, I got it. Like, that's the resonance, but I can't put it in words. And Ouspensky, on this sort of tightrope, manages, to be fair, better than pretty much every other book on Gurdjieff, to combine all these various elements. And maybe his fairly straightforward style goes a long way in helping us not get lost in purple prose. But it does retain a resonance, and it retains a mystery, and leaves you kind of going, not sure really what to do with this, or where I am, or who to trust. And that's a great start. And I think that actually goes a long way in the definition of both, of course, a miracle, but that leans itself towards a definition of something that is sacred. Do I want to go so far as to say In Search of the Miraculous is a holy book? No. Do I want to go so far as to say that it tarries alongside the sacred? Yes, the sacred is something that really, like the Tao, that can't be named. This man in this book manages to walk the tightrope of the Tao, and you just can't. If you lean into any element, while you lean into one of the centers once again, you fall back into sleep. And so you sort of just have to allow the paradox of it, allow the friction of it, and allow the mystery of it. It's just one of my, this review really came about just because I was rereading it and I wanted to talk about this aspect of it, which I think is overlooked, is that I think if it's approached as, oh, you want to learn Gurdjieff's system, you want to learn Gurdjieff's teaching, go read In Search of the Miraculous. And you're like, as if that's going to be done. And I think to quite cheesily change that, it would say, if you want to learn the system, go experience In Search of the Miraculous. Just the best way to experience Gurdjieff's system, and it's a bit of a paradox because, of course, it's never going to be like this, would be, I personally think, would be to somehow read In Search of the Miraculous when you need it, not knowing what it is. So like, that's what, that classic moment in many people's lives around between your early 20s and early 30s of like, just something's not sitting right. Like, I got everything and just something's not working. Like, the life doesn't feel fulfilling, or whatever it might be. That feeling, right? Again, that's a resonance. Can't explain what that feeling is. It's like saying to people, what do they want? And they say peace or fulfillment. Like, they're the closest words you can get to whatever the other side of that might be. And this is just such a perfect book for that moment. Like, you sort of, if you have a friend who's like, I'm just a bit lost, or something's not sitting right about the way life or the world is, this is a book you're like, don't look into it, just read it. And don't, because I think that is how Gurdjieff would want it. Because if you go into this with like, this is the book about Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, who both hold a lot of high esteem, you've brought something with you that I don't think is productive. Like, you want to go into this, you want to meet you, because it's such a beautiful book, because you have Ouspensky as your guide, who feels like this safe guide, and you meet Gurdjieff with him, and you're experiencing this same, like, oh, I'm being taken to a meeting, and I'm now, what's going on? And I think going into it with that sort of almost naivety and ignorance would be, maybe, I'd like to think it would be, just an experience of peculiarity, of being you really feel like something is at threat, like you're being ushered through the streets of Petersburg and put in all these weird little rooms and just listening to this strange Greco-Caucasian man. And it's fascinating, and it has a great feel. And it's one of my favorite. It's just, I adore it, and I will read it and reread it till the day I die, basically. But that is my thoughts, overview of P.D. Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous. Yeah. I would say, if you read it and you think, oh, Gurdjieff's a kind of, I would also say read Kenneth Walker's study of Gurdjieff's teachings as well. And then listen to the music. Look up, I'll put it in the links below, I guess, Gurdjieff and Thomas de Hartmann. There's one album which is the piano pieces that has been put together. It's beautiful. And again, gives that feel. So, yeah. But also, just read it as a book. I think it's just, I don't know, maybe like the Epic of Gilgamesh or something. It's in that vein of, even if you're not directly into this stuff, it's just a book to have, a strange feeling from. Mystery. It's a book of mystery. It's a book of wonder. And they're rare. They're very rare. But those are my thoughts on In Search of the Miraculous. Thanks for listening or watching.